Citizens, society, and the state. In many ways, Britain is a homogeneous culture. English is spoken by virtually all British citizens, and only about 13% of the United Kingdom's 64 million people are ethnic minorities. For much of British history, the major social cleavages that shaped the way the political system worked were based on multinational identities, social class distinctions, and the Protestant-Catholic split in Northern Ireland. In recent years, a major cleavage has developed based on race and ethnicity, with tensions regarding Muslim minorities increasing as evidenced in race riots in May 2001 in the northern town of Oldham, and similar disturbances in Burnley, Leeds, and Bradford a few weeks later. In more recent years, terrorist activities have deepened the divisions, a situation that many advanced democracies of Europe and North America now face. Multinational identities. The United Kingdom evolved from 4 different nations: England, Wales, Scotland, and part of Ireland. England consists of the southern 2/3 of the island, and until the 16th century did not rule any other lands. By the 18th century, England ruled the entire island and became known as Great Britain. In the early 20th century, Northern Ireland was added, creating the United Kingdom. These old kingdoms still have strong national identities that greatly impact the British political system. England. The largest region of Great Britain is England, which also contains the majority of the population. Throughout most of the history of the British Isles, the English have dominated other nationalities, and they still have a disproportionate share of political power. Today, the challenge is to integrate the nationalities into the country as a whole, but at the same time allow them to keep their old identities. Wales, west of England, became subject of the English king in the 16th century and has remained so until the present. Modern Welsh pride is reflected in the flag, the Plaid Cymru, and the fact that the language is still alive and currently being taught in some Welsh schools. Even though Wales accepted English authority long ago, some resentment remains, as well as some feelings of being exploited by their richer neighbours. Scotland. For many years, the Scots resisted British rule and existed as a separate country until the early 1600s. Ironically, Scotland was not joined to England through conquest, but through intermarriage of the royalty. When Queen Elizabeth I died without an heir in 1603, the English throne went to her nephew James I, who also happened to be the King of Scotland. A century later, both countries agreed to a single parliament in London. However, Scots still have a strong national identity and tend to think of themselves as being very different from the English. The Scots too have their own national flag, and the Scottish Parliament has recently been revived. In 2015, a vote for Scottish independence was narrowly defeated. Northern Ireland. England and Ireland have a long history of arguing about religion. After Oliver Cromwell won the English Civil War in the mid-17th century, he tried to impose Protestantism on staunchly Catholic Ireland, to no avail. English claims to Irish lands were settled shortly after World War I ended, when Ireland was granted home rule, with the exception of the northeast corner, where Protestants outnumbered Catholics by about 60% to 40%. Home rule came largely because of the pressure from the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, who used guerrilla warfare tactics to convince the British to allow Irish independence. Finally, in 1949, the bulk of Ireland became a totally independent country, and Northern Ireland has remained under British rule, but not without a great deal of conflict between Protestants and Catholics. Social class distinctions. Distinctions between rich and poor have always been important in Britain, with the most important distinction today being between working and middle-class people. The two classes are not easily divided by income, but psychologically and subjectively, the gulf between them is still wide. German sociologist Ralph Dahrendorf explains the divide in terms of solidarity, particularly among the working class. The point is that keeping the old job and living in the old neighborhood, the sense of family and friends, is more important than individual success. British social classes have traditionally been reinforced by education system. Public schools were originally intended to train boys for public life in the military, civil service, or politics. They are expensive, and they have educated young people to continue after their parents as members of the ruling elite. A large number of Britain's elite have gone to public boarding schools such as Eton, Harrow, Rugby, St. Paul's, and Winchester. Middle-class students commonly attend private grammar schools, where students wear uniforms but do not reside. The percentage of British 17-year-olds that are still in school is lower than in many other industrialized democracies. However, the leaving age for compulsory education was raised from 16 to 18 by the Education and Skills Act of 2008. The change took effect in 2013 for 16-year-olds and 2015 for 17-year-olds. The most important portal to the elite classes is through Oxford and Cambridge universities, or Oxbridge. Nearly half of all Conservative members of Parliament went to Oxbridge, as have about 1/4 of all Labour MPs. Percentages in cabinet positions are even higher, and prime ministers almost always graduate from one or the other school. Since World War II, more scholarships have been available to Oxbridge so that more working and middle-class youths may attend the elite schools. Also, the number of other universities has grown, so that higher education is more widespread than before. However, this trend was recently challenged since Parliament raised the maximum level of tuition in English universities from $5,400 to $14,500 in 2012, making higher education less accessible to many students. Ethnic minorities. According to the 2011 census, about 13% of the British population is of non-European origins, with most coming from countries that were formerly British colonies. However, most members of the minority ethnic population grew rapidly, increasing from about 7% in the 2001 census. The main groups are Black African Caribbean Black British, 3%, Asian British, Indian, 2.3%, Asian British, Pakistani, 1.9%, Mixed, 2%, Other, 3.7%. Because of tight immigration restrictions in the past, most ethnic minorities are young, with about half of the population under the age of 25. Percentages of minorities have grown despite the restrictions that were placed on further immigration during the Thatcher administration of the 1980s. The Labour government kept the restrictions in place, and the Conservative Liberal Democratic coalition government pledged to have net immigration, which was about 200,000 people in 2010. Since it cannot curb arrivals from the European Union, that almost certainly means a cutback on non-Europeans. The British have often been accused of adjusting poorly to their ethnic populations. Reports abound of unequal treatment by the police and physical and verbal harassment by citizens. The May 2001 race riots in several cities increased tensions, and new fears of strife have been stoked by post-9/11 world politics. Widespread rioting in the summer of 2011 was triggered when a young black man was killed by the police, leading to accusations of racial bias. Today there is some evidence that whites are leaving London to settle in surrounding suburban areas, resulting in a higher percentage of minority population living in London. Despite this segregation, the mixed-race population appears to be increasing, with the census of 2001 offering for the first time in British history a category for mixed-race people. Muslim minorities. Terrorist attacks, successful and attempted, have occurred in Britain over the past few years, with a major attack in 2005, schemes foiled by the government in the summer of 2006, and car bombings in 2007. Other advanced democracies have suffered attacks and plots as well. Of course, the United States was attacked on September 11, 2001, and the Madrid bombings in 2004 were Europe's most lethal terrorist incidents. In Canada, 17 people were arrested in June 2007 on suspicions of scheming to blow up buildings. In recent years, concerns about radicalized British Muslims has increased as some have joined extremist groups, such as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. The British government estimates that 500 or more British men and women have gone to fight for militant groups in Iraq and Syria. The 2014 beheading of American journalist James Foley drew renewed attention to the dangers posed by radicalized young British Muslims, and the government turned to anti-extremist imams for help to prevent their followers from adopting radical views. Although many European countries face these problems, Britain's risk for homegrown terrorist attacks may be greater than many other countries. Several problems for Britain are distinct minority-majority cleavages. Muslims have an identity of being a minority distinct from a well-established majority, such as the English in Britain, the French in France, and the Germans in Germany. In contrast, many people in the United States are immigrants, and the majority ethnicity of white Americans in many U.S. cities has already become a minority. With so many different ethnic and racial identities, the majority identity in the United States is not as clear-cut as it is in most European countries. Social class differences of Muslims. In the United States, many Muslims tend to be relatively well off, while many British Muslims are disaffected and unemployed. Many British Muslims are the children of illiterate workers who entered as cheap industrial labor, and their childhood experiences have not endeared them to British culture. Pakistani Muslims. Many Muslims in the rest of Europe came from Turkey and Africa, but the largest group of British Muslims comes from Pakistan. Since Osama bin Laden and his companions were found in Pakistan, some scholars think that a higher percentage of British Muslims are linked to Al-Qaeda than are Muslims in other countries. Lack of integration of minorities. Polls suggest that alienation of minorities in Britain may be higher than it is in other countries because the national culture has not absorbed the groups into mainstream culture. This problem is apparent in France as well, where girls are not permitted to wear headscarves at school. In Britain, they may attend classes in full hijab, but many minorities still feel as if they are treated as second-class citizens. Immigrants from Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Another major change in British demographics is an influx of about 1 million immigrants from 8 Central and Eastern European countries that joined the European Union in 2004. Poles, who've made up about 2/3 of the newcomers, are now the largest group of foreign nationals in Britain, up from 13th place in 2004. The main draw has been better job opportunities in Britain than in Eastern Europe, but the recession in 2008 led many newcomers to return home since the British job market withered. However, since the job market has been even worse in Eastern Europe, at least some of the new workers stayed in Britain. Many are migrant workers who pick crops in rural areas or fill other low-paying jobs that British workers shun. Although the unemployment rate's going up, the potential for labor conflict is real. By 2012, more than 130,000 immigrants from Romania and Bulgaria were living in Britain, and the number of immigrants coming from these two countries is continuing to grow. In 2015, as the civil war in Syria intensified, refugees poured out of the country and into Europe. The exodus created a crisis in Europe, and the British reaction was criticized by many. Britain did not accept quotas by the European Union, but instead came up with a separate policy. In September 2015, the Prime Minister announced the government's decision to accept 20,000 refugees from camps neighboring Syria, but none who have already traveled to Europe, sparking intense debate about the appropriate responses to the refugee crisis. According to Prime Minister Cameron, the refugee crisis complicates the issue of whether or not Britain will remain in the European Union. Political beliefs and values. In the early 1960s, political scientists Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba wrote that the civic culture, political culture, in Britain was characterized by trust, deference to authority, and competence, pragmatism, and harmony. The economic crisis of the 1970s and a continuing conflict regarding Northern Ireland challenged this view of citizenship in Britain, as have fears of terrorism in recent years. However, the overall characteristics seem to still be in place today. British citizens reflect that Almond and Verba saw as good qualities for democratic participation: high percentages of people that vote in elections, acceptance of authority, tolerance for different points of view, and acceptance of the rules of the game. However, social and economic changes during the 1970s altered these characteristics so that today British citizens are less supportive of the collective consensus and more inclined to values associated with the free market economy. Many observers believe that the politics of protest, or the tendency to disagree openly and sometimes violently with the government, have become increasingly acceptable. The rioting in 2011 confirmed this analysis, although the reasons for the riots are far from clear. Some manifestations of changing political beliefs and values include decrease in support for labor unions. British labor unions have strong roots in the Industrial Revolution, and class solidarity supports union membership. However, when unions staged crippling strikes during the 1970s, public opinion turned against them as people began to view unions as bullies to both the government and the general population. Margaret Thatcher's tough stance against the unions intensified strife between unions and the Conservative government. Increased violence regarding Northern Ireland. The issues surrounding British claims to Northern Ireland intensified during the early 1970s after British troops killed 13 Catholics in a Bloody Sunday incident in January 1972. The IRA and Protestant paramilitary stepped up their campaigns of violence. Although in recent years the groups have consented to negotiate with the government, the threat of violent eruptions remains strong today. Thatcherism. The Conservative Party controlled British government from 1979 to 1997. Although later modified by Prime Minister John Major, Margaret Thatcher's revolution toward a free market economy certainly affected political attitudes. She rejected collectivism and its emphasis on redistribution of resources from rich to poor and government responsibility for full employment. Thatcherism fostered entrepreneurial values of individualism and competition over the solidarity of social classes and the tradition of noblesse oblige. New Labour. Despite the radical changes of the 1970s and 1980s, Britain has not deserted its traditional political culture. Tony Blair led a Labour Party that loosened its ties to labour unions, and a new Good Friday Agreement on Northern Ireland was reached in 1998. Thatcherism has been incorporated into political attitudes, but in the early 21st century both parties are more inclined toward a middle path or third way. The coalition government formed in 2010, at first criticized as unworkable, also encouraged compromise, although significant differences of opinion existed among cabinet members. The election of 2015 left the Labour Party much weakened, and the choice of left-leaning Jeremy Corbyn as the party leader may represent a move away from the third way. Protests over the Iraq War. Not only did ordinary citizens vocally protest Britain's involvement in the Iraq War, many political leaders openly criticized it as well. In a political system where party loyalty is valued above all, many Labour MPs, members of Parliament, withdrew their support for Blair's policy in Iraq. The resistance to the party leadership extended to the cabinet, with several party leaders resigning their posts despite the strong tradition of collective consensus. The ill will spread into domestic affairs as well, so that Blair had little choice but to resign from office in June 2007. Voting behaviour. As in most other European countries, a relatively high percentage of qualified British voters go to the polls. Although there was a notable decline in recent elections, 66% voted in 2015, more than 70% of eligible citizens normally vote in parliamentary elections. Today, voters have less party loyalty than they once did, but voting behavior is still clearly tied to social class and region. Social class. Until World War II, voting in Britain largely followed along class lines. The working class supported the Labour Party, and the middle class voted Conservative. However, today the lines of distinction are blurred, partly because the society and parties themselves have changed. For example, some middle-class people who grew up in working-class homes still vote the way their parents did. On the other hand, many in the working classes have been attracted to the Conservative platform to cut taxes and keep immigrants out. In recent years, both parties have come back to the center from the extreme views of the 1970s and 1980s, as reflected in Labour leader Tony Blair's program to provide a third way or centrist alternative. However, the Labour victories of 1997, 2001, and 2005 showed that the party was the strongest among people who feel disadvantaged: the Scots, the Welsh, and the poor. In the post-Blair years, the distinction between Labour and Conservative parties have continued to blur, leaving room for other parties, particularly the Liberal Democrats, to compete for votes in all social classes. Regional factors. The Labour Party usually does well in urban and industrial areas and in Scotland and Wales. However, in 2015, Labour lost seats to the Scottish National Party, with the SNP picking up 56 of the 59 seats in Scotland. The industrial cities of the north, around Liverpool, Manchester, and Newcastle and Yorkshire, almost always support the Labour candidates, as do people that vote in central London. The areas where Conservatives usually win are mostly in England, especially in rural and suburban areas. These voting patterns are tied to social class, but they also reflect urban versus rural values.